If he's remembered at all, Floyer Sydenham is remembered as an old penniless scholar of Plato, whom the young Thomas Taylor met, and whose translations of Plato's dialogues Taylor absorbed into his own complete edition. Who was Floyer Sydenham? It's an intriguing name. It had been in my mind for a while, someone to look into one day. But then, about 10 years ago, I came across Floyer Sydenham in a different context. I was researching Thomas Anson of Chogbra and the possibility that there was a serious interest in Greek philosophy behind the mid-18th century Greek revival. Did the gentlemen who built the first authentic Greek follies in the late 1750s wander in their gardens discussing Plato? Yes, they did. A key source for my investigation into Thomas Anson's world is James Harris, 1709 to 1780, an MP, music lover, and one-man campaign to revive interest in Greek philosophy. His books, unlike Sydenham's, were read and debated. Concerning Happiness, one of Harris's three treatises, published in 1744, though written a few years earlier, has this dedication: J.H. to F.S., James Harris to Floyer Sydenham. Concerning Happiness begins with an address to Sydenham mentioning that among the long exploded systems, there was one, you remember, for which I professed a great esteem. Harris here is presumably referring to Stoicism. Some years later, Elizabeth Carter, whom Harris advised about her translation of the Stoic Epictetus, felt he was still a Stoic at heart. Harris writes to his friend Sydenham, "As you, I knew, were the favour of an hypothesis somewhat different," and the footnote explains, viz., the Platonic, "so I attempted to support my own by reciting you a certain dialogue. In this dialogue, the character Theophilus is the enthusiastic and rhapsodic Sydenham. This is nearly 50 years before Thomas Taylor knew the elderly philosopher. Sydenham and Harris had been fellow students at Oxford. They were lifelong friends. Sydenham was undoubtedly an eccentric and possibly occasionally unhinged, but he was never completely alone. He was a part, the most extraordinary part, of a small, forgotten 18th century Platonic movement. Thomas Taylor's own introduction to his edition of Plato tells us that he knew Sydenham in his last days. He writes, "I personally knew him only in the decline of his life, when his mental powers were not only considerably impaired by age, but greatly injured by calamity." Samuel Rogers's account of Taylor's recollections says, "On their first meeting, Sydenham shook Taylor warmly by the hand and said he reckoned himself truly fortunate in having at last met a real Platonist, deeply regretting his own want of familiarity with Proclus and Plotinus." The old man Sydenham, then, who has a want of familiarity with Proclus and Plotinus, is greeting a real Platonist, so says Samuel Rogers. Taylor is of enormous importance for his translations of Greek philosophy, but this comment seems too firmly to put Sydenham in his place. Was he not a real Platonist? Was he ignorant of later Platonism? Sydenham, it seems to me, carefully avoids any reference to later Platonists, such as Plotinus and Proclus, in his editions of Plato. He doesn't interpret Plato according to later ideas. But in his own personal writings, he does refer to Plotinus and Proclus. And I would say both Plotinus and Proclus are inspirations for Sydenham's personal Platonic vision, which Taylor would not have known, as this is largely revealed by Sydenham's unpublished epic poem Truth. As far as I can discover, I'm the first person to have read this work since Sydenham's death, apart from the British Library's cataloguer. In his last published book, Onomasticon Theologicum, The Names of God, which is his only publication of his personal view of Platonic philosophy, Sydenham calls Proclus the greatest of the Alexandrian Platonists, and refers to his wonderfully ingenious and fine-spun treatise. Sydenham writes, "Good itself is the same as the one itself, and is the cause of union and good at the same time. He, Proclus, concludes, the goodness is an uniting of things together, and that the uniting of things together is goodness." Here is Sydenham referring to Proclus, who he greatly admires. Truth, we see, is both above all and yet in all, and is also, Sydenham writes, ever raying forth. This is Sydenham's Trinitarian vision of truth, or we might say, and Sydenham occasionally does say, God. I'm not qualified to judge Sydenham's quality as a scholar. My interest is in exploring Sydenham's own thoughts in their historical context, a lost 18th century Platonism that lies behind the Greek revival, and in its curious echoes of the musical themes which I have been following in all my talks for the Fintry Trust. This might be an oversimplification, but this downplaying of Sydenham is due to the difference in points of view or agendas between Taylor and Sydenham. Taylor saw the mystery religions as a setting for Platonic philosophy. He was a pagan reviving this ancient tradition in opposition to Christianity. Sydenham has been seen as a Christian Platonist, though he never mentions Christian or biblical ideas in his works. He is scrupulously commenting on Plato in a purely Platonic context. Sydenham was indeed a clergyman in the Church of England, though in the 18th century that might not imply an interest in religion. I'm grateful to Tim Addy for explaining that Sydenham consistently sees the Platonic first principle as mind or intellect, which is also good, truth, and beauty, whereas later Platonists see a first principle beyond even these things. In other words, Sydenham's Platonic one is in effect a Christian idea of God, like the Platonic God of Saint Bonaventure and Pseudo-Dionysius. I sense that more than that, Sydenham is always seeing divinity in Trinitarian terms, with the one or word present as the essence of all things, and a ray of truth which shines from the source through all things as the equivalent of the Holy Spirit. The agenda of Sydenham and Harris and their circle, which included the important and attractive figure of Elizabeth Carter, is very clear. They were reviving Platonism in opposition to deism in the church. Deism, which was the prevailing attitude of the church in England at the time, saw God as completely detached from this world. God had set nature going and retired, leaving us to follow religious or moral laws, with no spiritual or supernatural element in life. To some, like John Locke, this left this world as something that was ours to exploit. In contrast, these 18th century Platonists revived the idea that this world was a theophany, something which was not detached from God, but emanated from God. Beauty and truth in this world were God's beauty and truth. Their Platonism was intended to be compatible with a Christian viewpoint, like that of the Cambridge Platonists a century earlier. The great inspiration for Harris and Sydenham was James Harris's uncle, the philosopher third Earl of Shaftesbury, whose philosophy is quietly Platonic and had an enormous influence throughout the 18th century. The other very important difference between Sydenham and Thomas Taylor is that Sydenham thought Plato was sometimes meant to be funny. Shaftesbury had argued for the importance of raillery or humour in debate. In the introduction to Plato's Io, Sydenham quotes Horace. A reader of Plato ought always to have in mind ridentem dicere verum quid vetat. What hinders but that serious truth be spoke in humour gay, with pleasantry and joke? Sydenham says that this dialogue, Io, could be acted by a troupe of good comedians. Taylor makes small alterations or corrections to Sydenham's translations, which subtly change the lightness of touch and sense of 18th century wit. Io is about inspiration. Sydenham's translation says, "For they, the poets, assure us that out of certain gardens and flowery vales belonging to the Muses, from fountains flowing there with honey, gathering the sweetness of their songs, they bring it to us, like the bees, and in the same manner withal, flying. Nor do they tell us any untruth. For a poet is a thing light and volatile and sacred. Nor is he able to write poetry till the muse entering into him, he is transported out of himself and has no longer the command of his understanding." This is probably the version the young Shelley knew. Shelley's friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg wrote, "And we perused with infinite pleasure the elegant translations of Floyer Sydenham." Sydenham's Io was the first of his translations to be published in 1759. It's part of a hugely significant moment in the history of the Greek revival and the rediscovery of the Platonic view of nature as a theophany. Io is dedicated to George, Earl of Littleton. This was the moment when Littleton had built the first authentic Greek building in England, a Doric temple at Hagley, designed by James Athenian Stewart, who had been at Hagley in November 1758, discussing the plan with his patron Thomas Anson, who would build an almost identical temple at Shelburne soon after. The Doric temple was a place from which one could contemplate Littleton's own Vale of Tempe. And indeed, James Harris and Littleton did wander about the gardens at Hagley discussing Platonic philosophy. The only person I know of who's published on Sydenham is Kyriakos N. Demetriou. He calls Sydenham a Platonic visionary of 18th century Britain. Yes, that's what he was. Sydenham was a Platonic visionary in his own right. He should have been, perhaps he was, the English Ficino. But Platonism was so much against the materialist mood of the time that very few bought, yet alone read, his books. Demetriou saw him as a visionary, but he didn't know Sydenham's unpublished writings, the lengthy manuscript of an unpublished epic poem, Truth, which gives us a glimpse of his personal vision of the Platonic universe. He also knew nothing of the biographical information which I've unearthed from comments about Sydenham in letters from mutual friends to James Harris. To begin with, some dry facts. Floyer Sydenham, the younger son of Humphrey Sydenham, was born in 1710 in Dulverton, Somerset. He was baptized on the 27th of June, 1710. Sydenham's father, Humphrey, died very soon after Floyer was born. The estate was inherited by Floyer's elder brother, Humphrey, who, according to Horace Walpole, was a mad high church zealot. It seems that Floyer didn't get on with his brother and wasn't financially supported by the family. Sydenham and James Harris were contemporaries at Wadham College, Oxford. Sydenham was awarded his BA on the 25th of June 1731, an MA on the 30th of April 1734, and became a Fellow the following year. He had already been enrolled in the Middle Temple to study law, and he still had rooms at the temple as late as 1747. Sydenham was called to the bar in 1735. This doesn't mean he ever practiced law. And now, extraordinarily, Sydenham enters the scene at a moment of critical importance in the story of the musical theology which I've been following in all my talks to the Fintry Trust. James Harris, in his treatise on music, painting, and poetry, which must have been circulating in manuscript several years before it was published, argues that music is very limited in its ability to imitate nature, but has, he writes, a power which consists not in imitations and the raising of ideas, but in the raising affections to which ideas may correspond. In other words, when words are set to music, the music creates an affect or mood in which the meaning can be conveyed to the listener, but the music itself doesn't communicate meaning. Harris's theory seems to forget purely instrumental music, which had developed as high art in the previous century. Does instrumental music have no meaning? In 1736, George Frederick Handel, who was planning to write new works in English which would attract a wider audience than Italian opera and be cheaper to perform, wrote Alexander's Feast, setting words in praise of music by Dryden. This seemed to go beyond Harris's ideas. Could music represent the burning of Persepolis? Could music convey images and ideas? Harris lived in the Cathedral Close at Salisbury. For many years, he was the organizer of the Salisbury Cecilia Music Festival. Harris and his lawyer brother Thomas knew Handel well, as did Harris's cousin, the fourth Earl of Shaftesbury, the son of the philosopher Earl. Harris planned to perform Alexander's Feast in Salisbury in autumn 1738. He asked his brother in London to hire or buy the music from Handel. And here's Sydenham's first appearance in the Harris archives. Thomas Harris in London wrote to his brother, I last night spoke with young Smith, who tells me his father, who was Handel's assistant, has not the parts of the ode to dispose of. Sydenham desires his compliments to you and tells me he intends paying you a visit for a week and will be with you on Monday next by the coach. And 3 days later, Thomas Harris wrote to his brother, I believe Sydenham will come as I mentioned, or as I fear no coach goes on Monday, on Tuesday at farthest. By him I send Handel's print, etc. Sydenham, it seems, regularly visited Harris in Salisbury on his way to visit his family further west. But in this case, Sydenham was actually delivering to Salisbury material from Handel. Just over a year later, Handel visited Harris at his home in the Cathedral Close at Salisbury. Sydenham wasn't in Salisbury at the same time as Handel, as far as I can see. He'd planned to go in October, but was unwell. James Harris suggested to Handel that he make an oratorio from Milton's poems L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, which embrace a wide range of moods and images, describing the melancholy and cheerful characters in picturesque settings. This would be another step on the road to English language works, which would appeal to a broader audience than the Italian opera, including, of course, Messiah in 1741. There could hardly be any poem which gave more opportunities for the kind of imitation and description that Harris seemed to think impossible. The question of the powers of music must have been in the air. Handel's apparent response to his holiday with Harris, when these ideas were probably discussed, was spectacular. On September the 15th, 1739, which must have been within days of his leaving Salisbury, Handel began to write a setting of Dryden's Ode to St. Cecilia, again a celebration of the power of music, and he followed this with the setting of the Milton poems L'Allegro and Il Penseroso. But Handel went further. He then wrote at great speed his monumental set of 12 concerti grossi, opus 6, his grand demonstration of what pure instrumental music could do. Handel seems to be saying, look what I can do, look at what music can do, Mr. Harris. Floyer's Sydenham's works show that he understood music. There's a passing remark in Sydenham's last published book, which is very significant in the light of this controversy about the communicative power of the language of music. Sydenham is writing about verbal language and the possibility that words could be formed. He says, the sound of which may have, like Handel's musical compositions, the power of raising in the soul ideas or images. Music raising ideas and images. How can music do this? This seems to be opposed to James Harris's ideas that music could only create a mood in which words would convey meaning. We have Sydenham's answer in his commentary on Plato's Philebus. For harmony and mind are connatural. Whatever beings therefore partake of either, partake of the same time of both. Hence it is that musical sounds uttered by human voices, or issued from any musical instrument of man's contrivance, proceed from what is of divine origin within him. Our music and the music of nature are the same divine language. Therefore, according to Sydenham's ideas, music itself, regardless of whether there are any words or not, communicates meaning to the soul. Samuel Rogers, passing on what he'd heard from Thomas Taylor about Sydenham, wrote, Sydenham was originally a clergyman with an income of £800 per annum, but having fallen in love with a young lady whose father objected to his addresses because he was in the church, he threw up his living and had recourse to the law as his profession. After all, it appears he did not marry the fair one for whose sake he had sacrificed so much. Having made no progress at the bar, he entered the naval service, went abroad, endured many hardships, and finally worked his way back to England as a common sailor. He was far from young when he first applied himself to the study of Plato. This is all very jumbled. In fact, even from what I've said so far, it can be seen that it really isn't true at all. Most misleadingly is the last point. Sydenham did not apply himself to the study of Plato when he was far from young. He was an enthusiastic Platonist in the 1730s, as we know from Harris's 3 treatises. I can find no other reference to a fair one. Sydenham was a clergyman. He was ordained in 1744 so that he could apply for the living of Esher, which was only available to fellows of Wadham College, and this would bring in a significant income. The story of Sydenham at sea seems to be an echo of the fact that Sydenham was appointed to a post at Codrington College in Barbados. He soon resigned the position. He might never have actually travelled there, and yet a later letter implies he had been to the West Indies. The letters that tell us most about Sydenham are from John Upton, editor of an edition of Spenser to which Sydenham contributed. Upton tells us a lot about Sydenham's religious interests. On the 1st of February 1746, or 1745-1746, John Upton wrote to Harris, Syd tells me he has been with you. Our old friend is deep in Jacob Bayman and commentators on the apocalypse. There were still supporters of the German mystic Jacob Boehme in London. It's quite possible that Sydenham knew some of these. Later that year, on December the 8th, 1746, Upton wrote to Harris, "When I was in town, I called on Sydenham, who, by the by, will die one day in Bedlam. He's quite a papist, and which is worse, has not sense to keep his opinions to himself, but talks of them in coffee houses." I feel Upton's comment has the ring of truth. If Sydenham was a Catholic at heart, what was it that attracted him? On August the 25th, 1747, Upton wrote to James Harris, "Our friend Sydenham is going to sell his books and then to Padua, then to commence doctor, but first he journeys into the West and intends to call on you. I spent a very agreeable morning with him very lately, and we talked for 5 hours together. Papisticality seems vanished, and in its room is a sort of mysticality." Padua was a famous centre for philosophy and medicine. Presumably Sydenham was intending to take a doctorate in philosophy. He's not recorded as a student there. He resigned from the living of Esher on the 2nd of November 1747, which left him with no income. This was reckless. Why lose his income without a serious reason? Had papisticality vanished? Why go to Padua? If he'd gone to Padua, he would have been able to experience the music of Tartini playing his violin solos in the Basilica of St. Anthony. Tartini was known as a philosopher-musician inspired by his Franciscan background and an influence on like-minded musical minds in England. But there's no record of Sydenham at the University of Padua. Sydenham was, though, left in poverty. John Upton wrote from his Oxfordshire family home, Barrington, on the 1st of October 1753. "I want to tell you that Sydenham has been with the Bishop of Exeter and publicly renounced his papistical errors, and desired to be received back again to the bosom of his good mother, the Church of England. Not, indeed, such an old woman or so garishly flaunting as the Church of Rome, but of a more benevolent spirit." From this point, Sydenham's friends began the scheme to set him off producing an edition of Plato, which would be a regular source of income. Unfortunately, this became the subject of arguments between the friends. Upton wanted a scheme where booksellers would pay for each section produced. Another friend, Arthur Collier, suggested a subscription system. This was finally adopted and was a disaster. There were too few subscribers and some never paid. The first volume, Io, which I've mentioned already, appeared in 1759, but the series stopped after 9 dialogues, though Sydenham seems to have translated others. From references to possible patrons in the text, Sydenham must have begun his epic poem Truth in the 1750s, just before he started his translations of Plato, and tinkered with it over many years. This is his most personal work, and it's remained almost completely unknown. His last published book was his own overview of Platonism, Onomasticon Theologicum, The Names of God, in 1782. There's no reason to doubt Samuel Rogers' account of Sydenham's last days in 1787. Samuel Rogers wrote, "Sydenham at that time lodged in the house of a statuary in the Strand. He was in very distressed circumstances and regularly received 2 guineas a month from Harris, the author of Hermes, that is, James Harris. He used to dine at a neighbouring eating-house where he had run up a bill of £40. This, as well as several other debts he was unable to pay, and his acquaintances refused to discharge his debts, though they consented to maintain him during his abode in the Fleet prison, where he was about to be confined. The night preceding the day on which he was to be carried to jail, he was found dead, having undoubtedly, as Taylor asserted, put an end to his existence. For some time before his death, he had been partially insane. James Harris's 2 guineas a month, over £24 a year, was equivalent to over £4,000 a year today. Harris died in 1780, but the payment was continued by his son, the first Earl of Malmesbury. The debts owing to the eating house, £40 or more, were the equivalent of anything up to £10,000 today, so it's easy to see why his friends were unable or unwilling to pay them. But Roger's remark does tell us that Sydenham had acquaintances. Sydenham wasn't alone and forgotten. He had acquaintances or friends, and more than that. Thomas Taylor and Samuel Rogers don't seem to want to admit that in 1787 there was a circle of Platonists in London who were in effect disciples of Sydenham. Whether this was really his intention or not, the effect of the story passed on by Thomas Taylor is that he, Taylor, was the first to promote Platonism in England after years of darkness. But this, of course, isn't quite true. The full story of Sydenham's last years is told by Stephen Jones in a new biographical dictionary published in 1805. Sydenham's disciples in the early 1780s belonged to a circle of London Platonists. Stephen Jones, who seems to have known the elderly philosopher's friends, gives an alternative view of his end to Taylor's. His acquaintance with the Greek language and his profound knowledge of the Platonic philosophy procured him many friends and disciples. Among the latter was Mr. Isaac Swainson, then in trade, and on that account familiarly termed the Greek woolen draper, now proprietor of a well-known medicine called Velno's vegetable syrup. Mr. S. introduced him to the Reverend David Williams, on whose ardent mind the impression made by the intensive knowledge and infantile simplicity of Sydenham was instantaneous but indelible. Unfortunately, the delicacy of Sydenham concealed from Mr. Williams the state of his finances, and his distress was not known until the fatal arrest took place, which, by inducing strong paralytic affections, soon terminated his life. In other words, Jones believes that Sydenham died as a result of his arrest and not by suicide, as Rogers and Taylor imply. The Reverend David Williams, on whose ardent mind Sydenham had made such an impression, had friends including Benjamin Franklin, Josiah Wedgwood, the architect James Athenian Stewart. These were all members of a radical Club of 13, which he led in the 1770s, and helped him to write the liturgy for a non-denominational philosophical church of a broadly Platonic style, which survived until his own congregation found him too severe in his attitudes. These Platonic friends felt a mixture of sorrow and shame at the philosopher's death in penury, and they campaigned for the establishment of the Royal Literary Fund to support impecunious writers. Sydenham's Onomasticon Theologicum was dedicated to another apparent supporter, Frederick Montague, who had been patron of the poet Thomas Gray, also a significant Platonic scholar, and the poet and gardener William Mason. Sydenham might have been little known even then, but his vision is not eccentric. It's the clearest expression of the philosophy, even if unspoken, that inspired this forgotten Platonic movement in the 18th century. For Sydenham, This philosophy has origins in far antiquity, harking back to, as he says, the Orphic theologians who introduced the Eastern learning into Greece and whose followers in theology were the Pythagorean philosophers. This wisdom was the source of the Eleusinian mysteries, and the secrets of the mysteries were the knowledge of certain truths, that, as Sydenham writes, deity is one, and that of the infinity of time past, as well as of time future, that of the immensity of space, extension or the first matter, that of the world's eternity, or rather its everlasting existence. And Sydenham writes that the most dangerous of these secret truths is the doctrine of God himself present within the soul of man, and ready to impart himself to converse with and to counsel those human minds who consult him with simplicity of heart and a love of truth above all things beside. This sounds like Sydenham's curious Platonic version of Christianity. The knowledge of truth is possible, Sydenham explains, because we have within us exact copies or perfect images of the real essences of things, the Platonic ideas. He writes, the whole created universe is a manifestation of the divine mind, a distinct declaration, or as it were, an open evolution of those ideas, which at the same time abide in that mind, inwardly enwrapped and comprehended as having there their natural and eternal seat. It is the nature of the human soul to have these ideas generated in her and to partake of mind eternal and immutable. Sydenham defined the purpose of philosophy in the synopsis of his projected Plato edition. He writes, the end of all the writings of Plato is that which is the end of all true philosophy or wisdom, the perfection and the happiness of man. And the two great objects of the Platonic philosophy are truth and virtue. Truth, the good of all mind, and virtue, the good of the whole man. Though illuminated by a vision of higher worlds, this philosophy is inseparable from its moral purpose in this world. He writes, but since every man is a member of some civil community, is linked with the fellows of his own species, is related to every nature superior and divine, and is also part of universal nature, he must always of necessity participate of the good and evil of every whole, greater as well as less, to which he belongs, and has an interest in the well-being of every species with which he is connected. Now we can turn to the vision of Floyer Sydenham in his own words. The philosopher ascends from the world of nature to the vision of truth, the one. Sydenham uses Plotinus's phrase, the all alone. He's guided by the two daughters of truth, virtue and wisdom. The most exciting feature to me of this vision is that Sydenham describes three worlds, the same three worlds as we find in ancient philosophy and in Francesco Giorgi in the Renaissance. But in Sydenham's vision, the middle world, rather than being seen as the celestial world of the symbolic planets and stars, is imagination, the world of images. In the imagination, divine ideas form new works with the aid of artists, and these include gardens, real gardens like Stowe, and imaginary gardens like the Garden of Alcina, and the statues you find in the classical houses and landscapes he knew. And even more extraordinary, imagination, the muses, places imaginary worlds directly into this world in myth. Floyer Sydenham begins his vision with an address to the muses, But these are really the sirens as described in Plato's Timaeus, who sing the harmonies of the planetary spheres and guide imagination.
Come, all ye muses, lead the song, not ye Parnassian, vulgar, various, of your aid to every rhymer liberal, but ye celestial, sitting on the radiant spheres, who rule in rhythm their motions as they roll, now leading and now following each by turns, who tune them as they sound for consonance, and with their varying motions while they change their sounds, form all one perfect melody. Ye siren sisters 9, whom at a birth the abyss of things pregnant by truth produced, come, join with me to celebrate your sire. Ah, daughters of truth, bring with you the arts which you inspire, and, in particular, the 4 arts which are born of harmony. The arts of the essential forms, numbers, arithmetic. The science of forms as shapes and dimensions, geometry. The science of celestial forms, astronomy. And music. In sounds there's several combinations, and what sounds agree in concord? Of what sounds the train makes harmony, and what harmonious parts in sequel the harmonious tuneful whole lead up, bring on, or close, to comprehend of music is the science. For harmony and mind are connatural. Whatever beings therefore partake of either, partake of the same time of both. Hence it is that musical sounds, uttered by human voices, or issued from any musical instrument of man's contrivance, proceed from what is of divine origin within him, and the force of them is felt only by what is of the same origin in others, namely harmony and mind. For nature's self, as it were, sings continually whilst she operates, putting rhythm into her motions, measure into her materials, and harmony into all her forms, tempering the lulling smoothness of concords with the rousing roughness of well-timed discords, framing many systems correspondent to each other, and composing all of them in one stupendous whole. The human nature, by partaking of mind, partakes of truth as well as harmony. Sire and sisters, compose your songs, and let your harmony lead me to your Father Truth. Truth, the first principle of things alone. Sameness, the summit point of intellect, the basis of all being, the root of mind, of form the centre, all outradiating, who being pure unity must everywhere ever be rising, ever raying forth. Faith and opinion are, we find, and must be, unstable and slippery foundations of virtue. There is therefore a necessity for man, who lives in this world of sense, that he should as frequently as possible introvert his attention and retire into himself to converse and hold communion with the fountain of his being, the author of all good to him. I knew her to be virtue herself, the daughter of truth, the fountain of being. Virtue could fly me upwards to the higher worlds. Soaring shall I escape, with thee ascend thy sire's bright chariot. There my eyes shall mix their kindred beams with his. Undazzled thence shall gaze the eternal world, filled with his light, nor fear the fullness of meridian day. This, I see, is the world of imagination, of images, of the ideas which live in the divine mind. For in mind they always are, but in man's mind lie dormant, till awaked by her fair handmaids, sciences and arts. The prime, the fundamental sciences of number and figure, those sole founts of harmony and beauty. The fine arts, which on the basis of those sciences raise rude materials up to beauteous forms of the mind's own conception, or select from every part of nature what is found in each the fairest. In the artist's mind assemble them, still following nature's rules, and copying thence exhibit fairer scenes than nature ever yielded, fairer forms than nature e'er created. Spenser's bower, Virgil's Elysium, Milton's paradise, Alcina's gardens, or the groves of Stowe. Forms for Pembroke's or for Orford's Hall, forms that would Badminton or Blenheim grace, that Radnor, Bruce and Richmond would admire. Not only have great bards the powerful skill with beings of Fancyland to people earth, the mighty magic of the muse can draw down from the sky this Fancyland itself, can seat it where she pleases, or in parts divide, and scatter like the Cyclades o'er the vast ocean. Like Latona's Isle, the floating Delos, where the goddess womb, after long wanderings and much labour, oped and gave to smiling heaven and joyous earth a Phoebus and a Diana. On the right hand of virtue then appeared a wondrous form, whose stature tall outtopped the measure of my shorter sight. A veil of cloudy darkness thick to vulgar eyes covers her head, down hanging to the ground. But through it I saw, her body saw, of human shape, but above human, glorious to behold. For white with snowy purity her skin shone silvery, soft, lucid like the moon. But her strong limbs with hair of auburn hue were graced, the sunny brightness of whose gloss omitted golden beams. Fair wisdom, I know, took her private solaces in the select society of minds that in the blessed ages of the lower world, bodies inhabiting, had spread her fame and uncorrupted worship in the earth. Her Shaftesbury, who wrote mysteriously of mind, and gave dark hints of highest truths so strange to modern days and novel doctrines. With wisdom's wings I ascended, drawn by the ray of truth. I could distinguish little spheres of light, mixing and parting at will, and these were full of lesser globes tinged with various colour. These colours, like jewels, seemed Juno's darling sapphire, the emerald the Nereid's favourite, fiery carbuncles, and heavenly roseate rubies, Phoebus' love the topaz, and Aurora's amethyst. While this, the glories of the scene, I gazed delighted, suddenly I found myself one of those spheres. Whether to such transformed, or whether loosened from my body, now first I discovered my own proper form. I found myself to be all mind. Every mental sphere resembled me in all things. And yet, one mind was not the other, each itself alone remaining. I saw myself all diamond, of pure uncoloured brightness. Of my being I saw the rude simplicity. But when my sire I gan contemplate, universal mind, ocean of beauty, even my brother orbs I saw not. Alone with thee alone I found myself, and thought I was him, himself, eternal all things. I have seen these things, seen truth, and now alone in this darker world I prophesy. Truth will return to this world. The world will be as new. For with thee, Truth, on starry throne seated, thy daughter, without mother born, shall reign, celestial Venus. While her son, his ivory sceptre heading with pure fire, ethereal pure, less powerful strikes the soul, he with his flame-tipped arrows, soft shall touch, shall charm his psyche, and as now the gods, then mortal hearts no less shall captivate, to serve true beauty. Under thee shall reign liberty godlike, as in golden days of Saturn. In thy blessed reign, heaven-sprung philosophy shall flourish, as of old in her first spring, when taught by the learned pipe of Samos sage, the Grecian songsters warbled airs divine. Then the Platonic muse in loftier strains thy conquests and triumphant joy shall sing.